Most people looked at the pile of corrugated galvanized steel sitting in the mud and saw a disaster waiting to happen. But Mara saw the future of survival on the high plains. It was late October of 1970, and the biting wind that whipped across the Dakota Flats was already carrying the scent of snow, a warning that the window for construction was slamming shut. To the locals, a home was made of timber, brick, and asphalt shingles, standing square and defiant against the horizon. What Mara had delivered to the site was military surplus, the kind of curved steel arches associated with temporary barracks or potato cellars, not a place to raise a family or survive a blizzard. The town elders at the hardware store didn't just whisper, they pointed. They called it the tin can and made bets on how quickly the frost would build up on the inside walls until the occupants were living in a walk-in freezer. But they were looking at the aesthetics, while Mara was calculating the thermodynamics. She wasn't trying to impress the neighbors with curb appeal. She was trying to solve a thermal equation that everyone else seemed to be getting wrong. The premise was deceptively simple. Take a lightweight, aerodynamic shell that the wind couldn't grab onto and anchor it over a heavy thermal mass foundation that would hold the Earth's heat. It sounded crazy to a population addicted to stick framing and forced air furnaces, but Mara knew something they didn't about how air moves and how heat stays put. The skepticism wasn't just idle gossip, it was aggressive. When the flatbed truck dropped off the curved steel panels, Miller, the local contractor who had built half the houses in the county, stopped his pickup by the property line to shake his head. He rolled down his window, letting the heat from his cab spill out into the chill air. "You can't live in a tunnel, Mara," he shouted over the idling engine. "That metal has zero R value. You're going to freeze to death by January, and that's if the wind doesn't roll that thing like a tumbleweed first." Jack, Mara's partner, looked up from the shovel he was using to clear the footing lines. He was a quiet man, strong but weary from weeks of doubting his own judgment, and he looked at Mara with a question in his eyes that he didn't dare ask out loud. He loved her, and he trusted her brilliance, but love doesn't insulate a house against 20 below zero. Mara didn't flinch. She walked over to the truck, resting a gloved hand on Miller's doorframe. "It's not a tunnel, Miller. It's a heat trap. And when your stick houses are leaking calories through every corner joint, we'll be sitting in t-shirts." Miller just laughed, rolled up his window, and drove off, leaving them in the dust and the cold. That moment cemented the stakes. It wasn't just about building a shelter anymore. It was about proving that the conventional wisdom of the entire town was mathematically flawed. The first phase wasn't the steel, but the stone. And this was where the real labor broke their backs and bonded their spirits. Most Quonset huts were bolted onto concrete slabs, sitting right on the surface where the frost heave could twist them. Mara's design called for a full stone basement, 8 feet deep, utilizing the native fieldstone that every farmer in the area cursed for breaking their plows. They weren't just building a foundation. They were building a thermal battery. The logic was ancient, even if the steel roof was industrial modernism. By sinking the living space partially into the earth, they utilized the constant temperature of the ground, which stayed around 50 degrees even when the air outside dropped to 30 below. Jack spent his days hauling stones that weighed as much as an engine block, his breath steaming in the crisp air, his muscles screaming in protest. Mara was down in the trench, mixing mortar by hand because they couldn't afford a powered mixer. There was a raw, gritty romance to the work. Not the soft candlelight kind, but the kind forged in shared suffering and a singular goal. They would stop for coffee from a thermos, their hands wrapped around the hot metal cup, sitting on the edge of the excavation pit. "If we pull this off," Jack said one evening, wiping mud from his cheek, "we're geniuses. If we don't, we're the town idiots." Mara reached out and squeezed his forearm, her grip strong and reassuring. "We aren't guessing, Jack. The math works. The stone holds the heat. The steel sheds the wind. Trust the stone. By mid-November, the basement walls were cured, a fortress of rock and mortar rising just 2 feet above the grade level. Now came the steel. The Quonset arches were designed to be bolted together quickly, a remnant of their military design for rapid deployment, but assembling them in a prairie crosswind was a test of sanity. Each arch was a giant steel rib that had to be hoisted up, held in place, and bolted to the next one before the wind caught it like a sail. It was dangerous work. A gust of wind could catch a loose panel and slice a hand open, or knock a man off a ladder. They worked in a rhythm, a dance of shouted commands and the metallic screech of bolts being driven home. As the structure took shape, it looked alien against the rolling hills. It was a silver semi-cylinder, gleaming aggressively in the weak winter sun. To the neighbors driving by, it looked like an airplane hangar had crash-landed in a pasture. The ridicule intensified. People stopped asking if it would fail and started asking when. They didn't understand that the shape was the secret weapon. A square house fights the wind, creating high pressure on the windward side and a vacuum on the leeward side that sucks heat out of the structure. The curved roof allowed the blizzard winds to slip over the top without turbulence, drastically reducing the wind chill factor on the surface area. Mara explained this to the grocer, the postman, and anyone who would listen, but their eyes just glazed over. They couldn't see the aerodynamics. They only saw a barn. The critical danger of a steel home, however, is condensation. This was the specific failure point Miller had predicted, and he wasn't technically wrong about the material properties. Steel is a thermal bridge. It conducts cold instantly. If warm, moist air from inside the house touched the freezing cold steel shell, it would rain inside. The walls would drip, mold would rot their clothes, and the dampness would kill them faster than the cold. This was the death trap scenario the town whispered about. Mara's solution was a bold deviation from the standard Quonset kit instructions. She wasn't just going to spray a thin layer of foam and hope for the best. She built a secondary interior frame, effectively creating a house within a house, separated by a distinct air gap and a massive layer of fiberglass batting that was twice the recommended thickness for the era. She was decoupling the living environment from the protective shell. Jack struggled with the framing, his carpentry skills pushed to the limit trying to build straight walls inside a curved universe. "We're losing square footage," he argued one night, the frustration boiling over as he tried to miter a joint against a curved beam. "We're losing space to insulation." Mara stood firm, her voice cutting through the fatigue. "We trade space for heat, Jack. You want a big freezing house or a small warm one? The steel is the shield, not the blanket. Don't touch the steel." It was a tense standoff, the kind that happens when exhaustion strips away patience. But Jack saw the fire in her eyes. He went back to the saw. He cut the wood. He trusted the vision. They were sealing themselves in, preparing for the stress test that the sky was already brewing above them. The first flakes began to fall just as they sealed the end walls, a dusting of white on the silver arch, marking the beginning of the real trial. The blizzard that hit in early December wasn't just a storm. It was an atmospheric assertion of dominance that the locals referred to as the White Wolf. It didn't howl so much as it screamed, a constant high-pitched shriek caused by wind shear tearing across miles of unobstructed prairie before slamming into the town. For 3 days the temperature plummeted, dropping past 0, past 10 below, eventually bottoming out at 22 degrees below 0, with a wind chill that promised frostbite on exposed skin in under 60 seconds. In the stick-framed houses down the road, the battle was frantic. Furnaces were running 24 hours a day, chugging heating oil at a rate that threatened to drain tanks dry before the roads could be plowed. Windows in the standard homes were icing over on the inside. thick ferns of frost creeping up the glass as the single-pane thermal barriers failed. But up on the hill, inside the silver curve, the experience was disorienting. The wind hit the Quonset shape and simply accelerated over the top. There were no eaves to catch the updraft, no flat walls to take the brute force impact. The structure didn't shudder. It didn't groan. The aerodynamic profile that Miller had mocked was now the only thing stripping the wind of its power. Jack stood by the south-facing window, watching the whiteout erase the world, his hand hovering near the glass. "It sounds like we're inside a jet engine," he murmured, the vibration humming through his boots. "But the candle isn't even flickering." The true test came on the second night when the power grid finally surrendered to the ice loading on the lines. Across the valley, the lights flickered and died, plunging the town into darkness and silencing the blower fans of 100 oil furnaces. In a conventional home, this is the moment of panic. Without electricity to circulate the heat, a house begins to bleed temperature rapidly, losing 10 degrees every few hours until the plumbing bursts. Mara and Jack were sitting in the lower level, the stone basement section, when the bulb above the kitchen table faded out. The silence that followed wasn't terrifying. It was heavy and insulating. They didn't scramble for a generator. They didn't panic. They simply lit a kerosene lamp and watched the thermometer. This was the moment the thermal battery was designed for. For months, the wood stove had been heating not just the air, but the massive stone walls and the concrete slab floor. That masonry sat at a dense 68 degrees. When the active heat source died, the rock began to discharge that stored energy back into the room. It was slow, radiant heat, the kind that feels like sunshine on a paved road after sunset. Jack pulled Mara close on the sofa, wrapping a quilt around their shoulders. Not because they were freezing, but because the storm outside demanded a human connection. "Miller is probably draining his pipes right now," Mara whispered, watching the orange glow of the lamp reflect off the fieldstone walls. "We're sitting inside of rocks that thinks it's still August." The knock on the door came the next morning, a frantic, heavy pounding that barely registered over the wind. It was Miller. His truck had slid into the ditch a quarter-mile down the road while he was trying to check on an elderly neighbor, and he had walked the rest of the way in the blinding snow, his face gray with cold, his eyebrows crusted in ice. When Jack cracked the airlock door, a small vestibule Mara had designed to prevent wind gusts from sucking the heat out of the main living space, Miller practically fell inside. He was shivering violently, his arrogance stripped away by the hypothermia creeping into his extremities. He expected to walk into a freezer. He expected to find Mara and Jack huddled around a dying fire in a tin can, suffering the consequences of their experiment. Instead, as Jack opened the inner door, Miller was hit by a wall of warmth so distinct it fogged his glasses instantly. He stumbled into the living area, peeling off his frozen gloves, his senses unable to reconcile the reality. The air didn't smell like damp metal or desperation. It smelled of coffee and dry pine. He looked around, blinking the fog from his lenses, waiting to hear the roar of a massive industrial heater. There was none. Just the small wood stove ticking quietly in the corner, and the silent, imposing presence of the stone walls. Miller sank into a chair, his trembling slowly subsiding as the ambient heat soaked into his bones. He looked up at Mara, who was pouring him a mug of black coffee, her expression devoid of any "I told you so" malice. She knew the victory wasn't in the gloating, it was in the physics. Miller took the mug, his hands still shaking slightly, and looked at the thermometer mounted on the central post. It read 68 degrees. He looked at the window where the outdoor thermometer was visible through a clear patch of glass. 13 below zero. "How?" Miller croaked, his voice rough from the cold air. "The power is out everywhere. My house is 40 degrees and dropping. You have barely any fire in that box." Mara sat down opposite him, her hand resting gently on Jack's knee. "We aren't heating the air, Miller. We heated the mountain. You're sitting inside 300 tons of thermal mass. The steel kept the wind off the stones, and the stones kept the heat for us. It's a 55-degree difference, maintained by rocks we pulled out of your field." The numbers were undeniable. The delta T, the difference between the inside and outside temperature, was holding steady at 80 degrees, total variance, but the 55-degree gain over his own failing stick frame house was the metric that broke his worldview. He wasn't just warm, he was safe. The tin can was the most stable environment in the county. When the storm finally broke 2 days later and the plows cleared the road to pull Miller's truck out of the ditch, the tone of the conversation in town shifted permanently. The eyesore on the hill was no longer a joke. It was a fortress. Miller didn't say much publicly. He was a proud man, after all, but the ridicule stopped instantly. People noticed that while their eaves were dammed with ice and their basements were heaving from the frost, Mara's Quonset sat pristine, the snow sliding effortlessly off the curve, the foundation shifting exactly 0 inches because the heat bleeding into the ground kept the frost line at bay. Jack stood outside on the first clear day, watching the sun hit the galvanized steel. He put his arm around Mara, pulling her into his side, the warmth of their bodies merging with the satisfaction of survival. They had built more than a house. They had built a proof of concept. The romantic tension of the build, the fights over angles, the exhaustion, the shared fear, had hardened into a deep, quiet bond, much like the mortar between the stones. They had faced the worst the high plains could throw at them, and hadn't just survived, they had thrived. As they watched Miller's truck drive slowly past, the contractor tapped his brakes, a silent acknowledgement, before rolling on. The future wasn't just in how you build, it was in understanding what you were building against.